All right, guys, starting a new series, the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So there's side notes right here. I'm going to read the side notes. The single opening sentence of the preamble to the Declaration of Independence displays brilliantly the ability of the document's principal author, Thomas Jefferson, to convey a wealth of meaning in just a few elegant words. It announces the Americans' intention of declaring their independence, of dissolving the political bands. It announces the Americans' intention of declaring their independence, of dissolving the political bands that had connected them to England. The justification for this extraordinary act was to be found in the laws of nature and the nature's God, and of nature's God. Jefferson, a deist who did not believe that God played an active hand in the affairs of mankind, nevertheless did believe that certain natural laws were God-given. This first sentence also signals Jefferson's awareness that a compelling public statement of the reasons for the decision to seek independence from England was necessary if America's political leaders were going to earn the support not only of the people of their own colonies, but equally important, of foreign nations like France, whose support for the American military effort against England was considered crucial, because France and England were enemies. First sentence signals Jefferson's awareness, a compelling public statement. Before declaring those causes which impel them to separation, however, Jefferson lays out the general philosophy on which America's quest for independence was founded. So let's read this other part. Jefferson's words. That was the little summary. So let's continue with the declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, the laws of nature and nature's God. Certain natural laws were God-given, like human freedom. We hold that these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Governments are instituted among men. The government's supposed to work for you, not you for the government. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Institute new government. So here's a long little note. The ideas embodied in the powerful opening lines of the second paragraph of the Declaration were not Jefferson's alone. The late 17th century English political philosopher, so in the 1600s, John Locke, had written in his second treatise of civil government, life, liberty, and estate were among the natural rights of mankind. Life, liberty, and estate, like a house. They were rights that existed even before governments were created, at a time when mankind was living in a state of nature. Jefferson's fellow Virginian George Mason, again following Locke, had included in the preamble of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, penned just a few weeks before Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, that all men are by natural, or that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, which he described as the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. But Jefferson's language has more forceful simplicity. The assertion that all men are created equal was in 1776 more an as yet unfulfilled promise than a statement of political fact. More an as yet unfulfilled promise than a statement of political fact, but it has helped to define some of the highest aspirations of the American nation throughout its history. The opening lines of the second paragraph were, in fact, merely a preface to the real punchline of that paragraph, the assertion of the right to rebel against the government of England. Jefferson reminds his audience that the very purpose of government is to provide the natural rights of mankind. Since governments at the time of their creation based their authority on the consent of the people whom they are governing, then it is also the right of the people to alter or to abolish that government if its actions threaten the very liberties it was created to protect. Realizing the dangers of living in a society without government, Jefferson was quick to add that once the people have severed their connection with their government, they must move to form new governments whose principles and powers would be supportive of the people's safety and happiness. Principles and powers would be supportive for the people's safety and happiness. Realizing the dangers of living in a society without government, he was quick to add once the people have severed their connection with their government, they must move to form new governments whose principles and powers would be supportive of the people's safety and happiness. Let's continue. Prudence, prudence, indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms of which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. The men representing their colonies in the Second Continental Congress had reached the decision to declare independence reluctantly, even painfully. And we're in a side note. They had a deep reverence for English common law and indeed for the body of law and custom that they called the English Constitution. And nearly up to the moment of independence, many of those leaders expressed great affection for the institution of the monarchy. For all those reasons, the men who endorsed the Declaration of Independence wished to emphasize that their decision was not one arrived at rashly, that they had done everything within their power to find some alternative to the decision to revolt against the authority of the crown. And that only the long train of abuses and the repeated injuries and usurpations committed by King George III had driven them to this final decisive action. Although Jefferson and those endorsing his declaration were no doubt sincere in their protestations that independence was only a last resort after all other peaceful means of protecting their liberties had been exhausted, the declaration's description of the actions and motives of the English king and government is hardly an even-handed recitation of the facts of the case. There was an element of hysteria, or perhaps of exaggeration for the purposes of propaganda, and the charge that the actions of the king and his government were deliberately designed to reduce them, the American colonists under absolute despotism, or that the entire reign of King George III, an imperfect but not evil sovereign, had been aimed at establishing an absolute tyranny over the Americans. But given the purposes of the Declaration to persuade an uncertain American public that revolution was the last and best hope, and to persuade foreign nations to give their aid to that revolution, even-handedness was not Jefferson's highest priority. And so what followed was a long list, taking up more than 2/3 of the whole document, of the grievances that had impelled Americans to take such desperate measures. So I wanna look up prudence. Prudence, the definition of prudence. That's important. Even in your just knowing stuff is important. Define prudence. Fucking thing on. Prudence. Internet is slow right here. Come on. Anyway, we'll just continue, guys. So number 1, it goes all the way to 27. So number 1, so they're these are grievances against the king. So when they say he, they're talking about King George III. So he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Like any power to, for laws, to legislate laws, to write laws, to bring laws to the table to be implemented. This was number 4. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of the public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures, like gerrymandering. Number 5, he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. So he's punishing, he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing him, pretty much. So number 6, he has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. Number 7, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and rather raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. So number 8, he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Number 9, he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and a fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Talking about the colonies in America, this is what he's been doing to them. He's at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas, so he has turned them like to go against the colonies. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So he's allying himself with the Indians, who, I mean, they're calling them savages, to like fight for them. Let's continue. So that was 27 of those grievances against the king. So here's the little side notes or the clarifications. The opening paragraphs of the Declaration display the talents of Thomas Jefferson as a literary stylist and a political philosopher. In the list of specific grievances, we see Jefferson, the lawyer, at work. Literary stylist and a political philosopher. It is an exhaustive and wholly one-sided bill of indictment of British rule in America. On the one hand, there was a monotony to the recitation of each of the 27 grievances, but on the other hand, as the list of grievances accumulates, Jefferson's tone, much like that of a prosecuting attorney delivering his summation to a jury, grows steadily more belligerent, more heated in its sense of outrage at British depredations, nor is it merely the British actions that elicit contempt. Even worse is the British intent. The British government and the British king in particular are portrayed as guilty not merely of bad policies, but also of proceeding with malevolent motives. The grievances laid out in the Declaration are not merely constitutional, they are also intensely personal. In the years leading up to independence, the colonists directed most of their petitions and complaints at the British Parliament. They often prefaced those petitions to Parliament with expressions of their pride and loyalty as British subjects and their affection, even reverence for both the institution of the monarchy and the person of the monarch himself, King George III. But by 1776, the Americans had reached the point where they were denying that Parliament had any authority over them whatsoever. If Parliament had no authority, then why even waste time addressing that body? Consistent with this denial of parliamentary authority, the Declaration studiously avoids any mention of Americans as British subjects. It speaks of Americans' fundamental rights as a people, and it lays the blame for the people's travail squarely on King George III, the he to whom most of the grievances refer. This decision to direct their ire at the king rather than Parliament signaled the Americans' intention to effect a fundamental shift in their allegiance, to sever altogether their relationship with their mother country as represented by the king. Buried in the long list of grievances, 17th of the 27 is the complaint with which the conflict with England began, and from which nearly all other grievances flowed. The denunciation of the king for imposing taxes on us without our consent. The American insistence that the British Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent provoked the first sustained colonial protests. Provoked the first sustained colonial protests, beginning with the Sugar and Stamp Acts of 1764 and 1765. The Sugar and Stamp Acts, respectively, and continuing with the Townshend duties in 1768 and the Tea Act in 1773. That this particular grievance appears in the middle of the list suggests how far the Americans had come in their opposition to the British control over their affairs. The British attempts to tax the colonies were an important catalyst for what would ultimately become a revolution, but they were only that. The real cause of the American Revolution went much deeper, to the very idea that only Americans themselves could be responsible for their own governance. There were several grievances that emerged as a direct consequence of the British decision to tax the colonies. The 10th grievance accuses the king of sending swarms of officers to harass our people, an accusation that no doubt refers to the British government's decision to send additional customs officers to America to an attempt to collect the new taxes imposed on the Americans. The 11th grievance condemns the king for sending standing armies to America in times of peace. From the British point of view, the troops were sent to aid the customs officers in carrying out their duties and to keep the peace in a situation that, from Parliament's perspective, was growing increasingly disorderly. From the American point of view, however, the decision to send the troops was one of the most ominous, for it raised the specter of military despotism and made an already volatile situation even more so. Adding insult to injury, the decision to send troops to America was accompanied by another parliamentary act that ordered Americans to provide lodging for those troops, which is going to be part of the which is gonna you're gonna come back to that later in the Constitution. The subject of the 14th grievance, the 13th grievance, one of the most convoluted in the list, charges the king with combining with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Charges the king with combining with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to. Those others were apparently the British Parliament, which in the Declaratory Act of 1776 had asserted its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, like just to govern for them, create the laws for them. And the Board of Trade, which was charged with implementing and enforcing the new taxes imposed on the Americans. Board of Trade and the Declaratory Act of 1766 had asserted its right to legislate for the colonies. And the Board of Trade, which was charged with implementing and enforcing the new taxes imposed on the Americans. Do we stop there? Yeah, we'll stop there for now, guys. We'll stop there for now. Interesting so far. Interesting. Just new knowledge I'm getting. So, as an American, I think it's very important. It's very important.